Well, good evening to everyone. I wanted to tell you that when Fuzz and I came through customs, there was a gentleman standing there, and he looked at Fuzz and pointed to the right, and Fuzz went right through. When he saw me, he pointed to the left, and he interrogated me for like 15 minutes. He asked me, well, what are you going to be doing here in Canada? And I said, well, I'm going to speak at a church and a Christian university. He says, well, can you tell me the names of these places? So I said, I think you'd be more friendly since you're going to be our 51st state. I'm going to build on Fuzz's talk, and I'm going to remind you of that question. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be human? Fuzz did a great job of talking about the dignity and value that we have as human beings because we're made in the image of God. And that image is so deeply connected to our value system. So looking at your screen here, these are what we call the 4 cardinal virtues. They're not only held by Jews and Christians, but they're held by people all around the world. All of the ancient philosophical systems held these virtues. Platonism, Aristotelianism, Stoicism, the Greek and Roman philosophy. And of course, these values of fortitude means courage, or maybe in our word, it would mean guts. Temperance, of course, is very much a biblical concept, self-control or restraint. Then there's justice. We have a lot of discussion over the last few years about what is justice. I think the word reflects better fairness. And then finally, prudence or wisdom. So these 4 cardinal virtues are joined by the 3 great Christian virtues of faith, hope, and love. Now, let me tell you, C.S. Lewis, by the way, I learned recently that C.S. Lewis has 500 million books in print. 500 million. That's a few more than Fuzz and me have got in print, by the way, just a few more. But C.S. Lewis was a remarkable individual. I think he predicted modern day Western society. And so I've entitled my talk, A Culture of Men Without Chess, provocative idea that Lewis uses, and C.S. Lewis's warning for today. So I want to begin with a German term called Zeitgeist. Zeitgeist refers to the spirit of the age. Geist means spirit or ghost, and Zeit means time. And so the issue here is, what are the ideas, what are the beliefs that deeply influence the culture in which we live? And I would say that today, those things that influence us are things like same-sex marriage, abortion to infanticide. In the Western world today, there are many people who believe that a woman could have an abortion all the way up to birth itself. So that's no longer abortion, that's infanticide. That is the killing of a child. And of course, we also have issues like children being sold into sex slavery. Boy, these are ideas I never anticipated. I remember growing up in Southern California in a Catholic neighborhood, and it was almost shocking for people to even get a divorce, let alone the idea in 2015 where the United States said that marriage between people of the same sex was now the law of the land. So how did we get here? How did we get to this place? And I want to say that I think we see 2 very different prisms of reality. Classical Christianity has always talked about truth, goodness, and beauty. Truth, goodness, and beauty. God not only has truth, goodness, and beauty, but God is truth, goodness, and beauty. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So when God created the cosmos, he permeated that cosmos with truth, goodness, and beauty. And all 3 of those values point to God. Now, Western civilization has made some changes over the last century or so. I think we now live in a post-Christian age. I think we live in a postmodern age, and even a woke period. And replacing truth, goodness, and beauty, what is the prism now? Race, gender, and class. So we even have kind of a neo-Marxist idea. Marx talked about comparing people according to economic categories. Well, the change is now we'll evaluate people in terms of their race. So there are worldview differences. It's not surprising to me that in America you have a great division among Americans. You have people on the left, about 50%, and you have another side, the right, 50%. And the differences are no longer merely political, they're worldview in orientation. Now, as much as I think the world has changed, I also want to say none of this is new. Let me take you back 2,500 years ago to ancient Athens, and I'll introduce you to the person that maybe was the greatest philosopher who ever lived. His name was Socrates. And every great philosopher has an opponent. Well, Socrates' opponents were called the Sophists. And I think Socrates, even though he was Greek, and he certainly couldn't have been Christian because he lived 500 years before Jesus was born, but in many ways, Socrates is closer to Christian theism, and the Sophists were kind of the early stage of what I would call secular postmodernism. So let's look at these categories a little bit. Remember, our society is in some ways called a post-truth society. Maybe there is no truth. Well, that's interesting. I guess the truth is there's no truth. Well, let's look at what Socrates said about truth. He said it was objective. It's outside of you. It's independent of you. It's absolute. It's universal in orientation. He said that truth could be known. It wasn't always easy to know it. You'd have to work at it, but truth was knowable. It was discoverable. And so for Socrates, mathematics is not invented by human beings. It's discovered. Moral principles are not invented by human beings. They're discovered. He said that truth corresponds to reality. So if I think 2 + 2 = 4, and if 2 + 2 does equal 4, my idea corresponds to reality, and I know the truth. And then lastly, Socrates said that truth should be the object of a person's life's pursuit. Right? When I told my dad, who was a World War II soldier, who was very pragmatic, I told him, Dad, I want to take a degree in philosophy. He said, how much money does it pay? And I said, well, I don't care about the money, Dad. I just want the truth. And he said, you can't handle the truth. No, there's this movie that I watched reminds me of my dad. Well, what I did say to my dad is, I said, Dad, when you fought the Nazis in the Second World War, you were battling an ideology. Ideas really matter. In fact, ideas can lead to the death of millions of people. It's believed now that maybe 70 million people were killed in World War II, and 80% of them were killed by the Axis powers. The vast majority of people killed in World War II were civilians. Remarkable things. Now, the Sophists come along and they challenge Socrates. They say truth is not objective, it's not outside of you, it's subjective. Truth depends on your perspective, your view, your take. It's relative, it changes from individual, culture to culture, even person to person. Some would even say that truth can't be known. They would even say that truth is invented. And they would propose that truth is only useful or workable. Those things are more important than truth. And then finally, truth, according to the Sophists and today's postmodernists, it's less important than power. So are these power relationships. This is what we have seen over the last 50 years, and it's been coming for 2,500 years. Now, C.S. Lewis, how many of you have read a book by C.S. Lewis? Yes. I think C.S. Lewis was the most influential apologist of the 20th century. The Chronicles of Narnia, anybody read that? Read it to your kids? It sold 100 million copies. Lewis is a storyteller. It tells you how important stories are in communicating a narrative. Well, Lewis wrote this book. It's called The Abolition of Man. And it is not the typical C.S. Lewis book. This book is dense. It is not explicitly a Christian work, and it is Lewis's most philosophical writing. I don't encourage people to begin Lewis with this book, but in many respects, this may have been Lewis's most important book. Now, let me tell you what the Lewis Institute says. It says, in this book, The Abolition of Man, Lewis was prophetic in pointing out that relativism, values change, society to society, culture to culture, person to person. The idea that there are no absolute truths would lead to the decay of morality and a lack of virtue within society. Without a belief in and the teaching of universal moral laws, we fail to educate the heart and are left with intelligent men who behave like animals, or as Lewis puts it, men without chests. In a classical Christian world, education was not just learning facts. It was intended to transform your character. Today, we have brilliant people who have amazing knowledge of facts and data, but they have left value systems. Now, here's Lewis himself in The Abolition of Man. He says, we make men without chests and expect them to be we expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid geldings be fruitful. You know, we've all heard the very disappointing things when Christian leaders fall, when they live a life of hypocrisy. Now, all of us are hypocrites. What I mean by that is a lowercase h hypocrite. None of us love God with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and our neighbor as ourselves for 15 minutes, let alone our entire life. That's why we need a Savior. But what's interesting is that people who are secular and skeptical, they have very challenging ways of kind of living up to ideas. And so there are many secular people who engage in all kinds of reckless type behavior. Now, let me move a little bit further here. Lewis says to be a human being, you have to be in connection with the objectivity of values. If we step outside of our values, it will lead to the abolition or the death of human beings. Frankly, and it's scary, I think we are now in that age that Lewis talked about. We have lost our humanity. We have men who say they're women. We have women who say they're men. We destroy children in the womb and accept it all the way up to the birth of the child. Lewis defends the objectivity of value, moral truths that are outside and independent of ourselves by identifying the universal moral law. This is traditional morality that all great philosophical and religious traditions have recognized and acknowledged. This is a critical idea. Lewis says in The Abolition of Man that this isn't just a Christian idea. There are objective values, and those objective values are every bit as real as the universe staring us in the face. I'll be perfectly candid with you. To me, knowing that raping a woman or murdering an innocent person, I know that is every bit as real as the physical universe that I look at. God has created us in the image of God. Humans have dignity and value. Take God away, the dignity and value go away. Lewis said this is not just a biblical idea. It's not just Jews and Christians who believe this. And he goes on to say that this universal moral law defines human nature, and thus to step outside this objectivity of moral tradition means we cease to be human, and it results in the abolition, the end of man. You know, right about the pandemic, people began saying all kinds of unusual things, saying things like, we no longer recognize these kind of traditional moral principles. They would even say things like, Christianity and Judaism, they're all about dominating society. There is the oppressors and the oppressed. Well, what's interesting is, and I've shared this with Fuzz and we've talked about this, when I first started in apologetics in 1987, I would go to the universities and give talks about Christianity, and all the questions from the students and the faculty, they would be truth questions. They would say, how do you know God exists? What makes Jesus any different than Muhammad or Confucius? Or they would say, how do you know Jesus rose from the dead? Move forward about 20 years. I went to the University of Missouri, and I began noticing that students and faculty, they still ask truth questions, but now they would say, how do you know that Christianity is good? How has Christianity been good for women? How has Christianity been good for racial minorities? And I noticed that the truth questions had now been questions about the goodness of Christianity. In my book, Christianity Cross-Examined, I defend both that Christianity is rational and that it's good. A couple of examples of the goodness of Christianity: the natural sciences. They were birthed within a Christian worldview. It was the medieval universities, Oxford, Cambridge, the University of Paris, the University of St. Andrews, and on and on and on. These were medieval colleges. When I was recently at Oxford, I had to pinch myself. I kept telling myself, Ken, this university is almost 1,000 years old. The Christian culture of the 17th century birthed science. It didn't start in China. It didn't start even in the Greco-Roman world. There were contributions made by all kinds of civilizations. Christianity birthed science. Education was sacred within a Christian context. The Catholic monks in the monasteries, they copied manuscripts. They kept culture alive after the collapse of the Roman Empire. And even things like capitalism and democracy have been deeply rooted in the Christian tradition. So when I go to the university now, I defend the truth of Christianity, but I also defend the goodness of Christianity. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't imperfections. That doesn't mean there aren't dark sides of the faith. But I'm old enough to remember the 20th century, where 100 million people were murdered in the name of no God. Dialectical materialism, communism, 100 million people. The number of people killed in Christian history, as terrible as that was, is a mere drop in the bucket. The danger is not people being killed in the name of God. Historically, it's people being killed in the name of no God. So Lewis says, if you step outside these moral values, you'll lose your humanity. Now, here is, I thought I knew a lot about C.S. Lewis, and then I met Michael Ward. Michael Ward is probably the greatest living C.S. Lewis scholar. He says, quote, "The abolition of man is about the objectivity of value and what will happen if we deny the objectivity of value. So it's really both a defense and a prediction." I think Lewis was a prophet. He saw our society coming. He saw the postmodern world. And we are living through that. And in many ways, we have to go back to truth, goodness, and beauty and jettison merely race, gender, and class. That doesn't mean there aren't important issues relating to race. That doesn't mean that there aren't important issues relating to the dignity of the two sexes. Those are important issues, but they're not the dominant issue. Now, Lewis writes in his book, The Abolition of Man, and again, this is not intended to be merely a Christian or a biblical perspective. So he even uses the Chinese, the Tao, the way. And he says that all of the great philosophical and religious traditions that affirm the objectivity of values, he gives an abundance of them. He says the world religion traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, I could add Zoroastrianism, they all have an objectivity of values. And I'm going to identify what that is in just a minute. But it's not just the great world religions. It's also found in the folk religious traditions, in the Babylonian religion, Australian, Aboriginal, Native American, Norse, etc. It seems as if human beings are created with a value system. The great Christian philosopher St. Augustine said when God made us, he made us to be lovers and worshipers. But when we became fallen and rebelled against God, instead of worshipers, we became idolaters. And instead of loving God and loving our neighbor, we began to love ourselves. I think Christianity has great explanatory power. Blaise Pascal said humans, and now I'm echoing Fuzz's talk, humans are this enigma of greatness, degree, not mere degree, but difference in kind, and wretchedness. We're a great, exceptional humanity, and yet we're also wretched. Quite frankly, I don't think you need the devil to find the Holocaust, as terrible as that can seem. Even people in a modern society can turn on other people. And the 20th century is our evidence of that. Now, what is objective values? What are we talking about? We talk about the golden rule. This is the rule of beneficence, reciprocity. The golden rule is the principle of treating others as one would want to be treated by them. Treat other people the way you want to be treated. Now, that rule may appear as a positive or a negative injunction. Jesus said, treat others as you would like to be treated, but here's what Confucius said. Do not treat others in ways that you would not like to be treated, in the negative. What you wish upon others, you wish upon yourself. There is a connection between us and God and our related people. Now, I want to look very carefully at this idea of how is it that all the religions are similar? And by the way, I think we should look at it that way. Fuzz says we're all made in the image of God. We're also recipients of general revelation. David says the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies are communicating God. Paul says in Romans 1, we have a conscience where God's awareness is given to us. We have what we call in theology common grace. The good Lord allows sun and rain to fall on people. He gives people gifts and talents. All of these come to all people. So let's look at the last of the 6 commandments. Think of the 10 commandments for a moment. The first 4, no God before the Lord, no graven image, don't take the Lord's name in vain, honor the Sabbath day. But then the last 6 shift to values relating human to human. Honor your father and your mother. Well, the Asians would go further. The Asian religions say honor your elders, your ancestors. But notice that this favors family. Do not murder or kill. The Buddhists say you cannot kill. Jews and Christians say the term is murder. You can kill in self-defense. You can have a police force. You can have a military. I remember when my father, not too long before he passed away, we had a heart-to-heart conversation, and he said to me, Ken, what is God going to do with me? He said, I did a lot of killing in the Second World War. I said, Dad, you helped stop the Holocaust. It is people of noble nature that fight evil people. So there is a place to kill. Now, again, in Buddhism, they would say no killing at all. But you know what all of this indicates? It favors the sanctity of life. If you murder another person, Moses says God could require your life because he's the one that gives it. You shall not commit adultery. That favors marriage. You shall not steal. That favors work. You shall not lie. It favors honesty. You should not covet. That favors respect. All of those religions, all of the religions of the world have the last 6 of the 10 Commandments. That's why I say when you meet people in another religion, you should expect that they will get many things correct. But then they'll have different gods and different Christs and different gospels. And I think that's exactly what we see. There is this objectivity of values. Now, compassion for widows, orphans, and sojourners. We have a big debate, and I think debate also exists here in Canada, of caring for immigrants, but at the same time wanting to preserve and protect our borders. And so the question is, some people would say, all we should think about is caring for the immigrants. Others would say, no, we should just protect our borders. I think it's both. We don't want criminals coming into the country who will prey on other individuals. But the Bible is crystal clear that the difference between Yahweh and the Greco-Roman gods is the Greco-Roman gods, they're interested in seducing the maidens. They are created in the image of man. Whereas Yahweh, he cares about widows. He cares about orphans. He cares about sojourners, immigrants. He cares about the powerless, and he tells us we should care about them too. But certainly protecting our country is also a life issue. So it is not an either or, it is a both and. So the law of magnanimity is what Lewis talks about: charity, generosity, mercy, kindness. Magnanimity is a great mind or a great heart. And here is a picture of Clive Staples Lewis. He's 19 years old. He's in the Somerset Light Infantry in the British Army. And in those days, they called it the Great War. It only became World War I after this incredible Second World War. I think it's interesting. The British call the Second World War, the Americans call it World War II. Lewis was right there in the trenches. He was wounded. It probably was a good thing. It probably saved his life. And so again, we have these virtues: fortitude, courage. Sometimes you have to fight. Temperance, self-control, and restraint. We're not animals. Justice, fairness, and prudence, wisdom, knowing the right thing to do at the right time. Here's Lewis in his little book, Mere Christianity, which was the first Christian book I ever read. I used to carry it in my pocket, and I'd go to parties with my friend, and I'd pull out my C.S. Lewis book and read passages, and people would say, hey, next time don't bring Ken with you. We don't want to hear all these C.S. Lewis passages. Here's what Lewis says about morality. He says, think of a country where people are admired for running away in battle, or where a man felt proud of double-crossing all the people who had been kindest to him. I remember my dad telling me at the Battle of the Bulge, he could hear the German soldiers singing Silent Night. It was the coldest winter in 100 years. On Christmas, I often think of my dad in a foxhole, freezing. And what's interesting is my dad said we would never leave our men behind. Oh no, we're not going to leave any of our men behind. I remember telling that to an ethics class that I taught in California, and one of the students kind of sneered and was sarcastic and kind of laughed at it. So I said, my dad's generation wouldn't even leave you behind. Why? Because there's a dignity and a value. So how does this work? Well, because the Bible says we're made in the image of God. It says that humans receive general revelation. We know there is a God, but we suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And we are reliant upon the Holy Spirit through the gospel to open ourselves. St. Augustine says, incurvatas in se, Latin, the fall has made us curved in on ourselves instead of being moved out toward by God. So we're saved by his grace, and we're all recipients of common grace. God's goodness is seen in our life. Now, how about this idea of head, belly, and chest? Why does Lewis use this idea of men without chests? Well, Lewis thought that the head, that kind of reflects our spirituality. That's our cerebral wisdom. Fuzz put up that pretty cool comparison of the two skulls of human beings and primates. Well, the belly is where we feel, and for Lewis, that's the animals. We feel, it's our visceral sense, but the chest integrates thought, the intellect, and the feeling through trained habit. And so the chest is the heart. It's the seat of magnanimity. We're not merely like animals in degree. We're different in kind. And what I have been pleased to hear from talking and reading Fuzz's work is there seems to be a growing, maybe even consensus, that humans are not merely different from animals in degree, but they're different in kind. That supports, I think, very much a biblical and a creationist viewpoint. So men without chests, these are intelligent men, but unfortunately they have no character, and so they behave like animals. Now, Lewis's dire prediction appears to be manifesting in our present cultural zeitgeist. Stepping outside of the objectivity of values, our culture appears to be losing its humanity. Lewis predicted a decay of morality and a lack of virtue within society. Same-sex marriages, sex and gender distinction. Biological sex is not binary. Infanticide, human trafficking. Can you imagine? Jesus said, if you hurt one of these little ones, it would be better for you to have a millstone around your neck and cast into the sea. Can you imagine how hot hell is for people who sell children into sex trafficking? You know, lots of people have problems with hell, but if there's no hell, there's no justice. God is going to make all the broken straws, and he's going to make them right. God is a God of wrath, but he's also a God of holiness and a God of love and a God of wisdom. So if we move outside of these objective values, ladies and gentlemen, it will lead to the abolition of man. And I think we're seeing that today. I've written on worldviews in a world of difference. I am so happy that a number of my books has been translated into other languages. Fuzz and I were talking, because both of us are writers, how exciting it is to be an author and discover that people you never thought would read your book are reading it in the language of Pakistan or Indonesia or in Iran. And I'm so grateful to God for that. I have also written a book on classic Christian thinkers that I've talked about. I mentioned Christianity Cross-Examined. And then I think Sunday I'm going to talk a bit about clear thinking, which is a book that I think we have back in the book place. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to come to our allies, the wonderful Canadians. Thank you very much.